Hello,
Hey,
I'm Alex,
I'm Val.
and we're back to talk about Sopranos,
Yes,
making our way through the show.
we are a little slower than we like to be.
Yeah,
We like to do 2 episodes a week.
but we missed Monday. Just couldn't happen. We tried.
Yeah, we we really do try, but I hope you guys don't mind. We're nearing the end.
We are. So, yeah, you wouldn't have to put up with this much longer. And if you're in the future, then this is irrelevant. So,
So we're gonna talk about Luxury Lounge.
yeah. So, episode 7, written by Matthew Weiner, directed by Danny Liner. Don't know how to pronounce it. That's okay. Irrelevant. It's an interesting episode. They're really kind of... It's kind of one of these standalone episodes of Sopranos, for me, where there's kind of a departure from the arc of the season on the whole, and we kind of have a storyline that exists in and of itself. And it's interesting because they kind of choose to focus mostly on Artie. And it's an opportunity to really expand Artie as a character, which is something that is kind of coming out of nowhere in the context of the season.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of one of the last moments where we do really expand Artie as a character in the entire show.
Yeah. I always mention the YouTube channel that doesn't exist anymore that pieced
Maybe
together
it'll come back.
pieced together full character arcs. I really wish it still existed, but I did watch Artie's. And it is true that this is actually very much towards the end of our time with Artie. And that's not giving away there's nothing dramatic to give away.
Yeah.
But we haven't really seen Artie for a while
Yeah.
in the show anyways, right? So to have an episode that's so highly focused on him and his identity and the way his restaurant links to his identity, and the way food kind of links to other elements of the show.
And also
really
his psychology.
Yeah.
I mean, like at the end, kind of Tony coming and saying, I have a psychiatrist that I'd like to recommend to you. Also, this kind of window into Artie's wrestling with the big questions of who am I, and am I happy, and where am I going? The things that we've been talking about with other characters in this season in particular, we're now able to kind of witness that for Artie, which we don't really get at many other points throughout the entire series.
No.
That doesn't happen that often. So it's almost kind of fitting because as the show draws to an end, it's an opportunity to kind of flush out some of these characters who've been there from the very beginning.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting, because we do see in this episode in particular, we have a lot of things that kind of harken back to other earlier moments of the show. Yeah. And this interaction that Artie has with women is something that we've seen again and again throughout the show. It makes me think back to when Adriana was working at the restaurant and kind of the jealousy.
And also this Armagnac, the French storyline.
Exactly.
So it's very repetitive. And I think there was some criticism of that, but I actually think it's kind of the point. There's kind of something mundane about it. There's something kind of repetitive about it. It's that Artie kind of keeps on finding himself in the same situations. There's not really any excitement, and it's the fact that we've now been privy to the fact that the same things just keep on happening to Artie, and he's always kind of susceptible to the same things. He finds himself in the same kind of trouble. His relationship to Tony and the mob exists in the same way, where it always kind of leads him into these places where he kind of screws himself over.
Yeah, and he's so highly focused. He talks about his dad saying, honest work pays off in the end. Right?
What a joke.
And, but he is a character in Soprano world, Soprano land, who has stayed out of that, right? He grew up with Tony. He made different choices than Tony. Right? However, he's still locked in their orbit, right? He's still, even though he doesn't take money from them and whatever, all this bad shit happens to him because he is connected to them.
I mean, he also is responsible.
He is also responsible, yeah.
In very questionable ways.
Yes. But I love that, that's, I don't know, everyone focuses on, Artie, just don't go and talk to people. That's the solution. That's the solution here, right?
I mean, it does seem annoying.
He's annoying. He's annoying. Poor guy.
Sparks flying. It's going to be a high chair.
Yeah, poor
I like
guy.
people's, the development of people's reaction to that statement throughout the episode. People are getting more and more unimpressed by his banter. It is really interesting though, because like we have even the setting of Vesuvius, the way that it's kind of set up, like in the beginning of the episode, there's this billboard for it, and they actually say like an affordable elegance. And I think there's kind of this environment that's created at Vesuvius and is kind of focused on in this episode, where it's kind of a space that is, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like an in-between place, and Artie is kind of like lacking in identity in that he's attached to the tradition of cooking, and it is a very key part of who he is, but he doesn't have what he wants. Like, he doesn't feel like a success. Like, it's in this kind of middle ground. Like, it is this kind of like affordably elegant place that doesn't really bring him fulfillment. And actually, there's like a lot of focus on the murals in the back and of what I imagine is Mount Vesuvius erupting, that we see multiple times, actually, like right after. You know, like with the billboard, there's a scene where we see the volcano near the end. There's a scene, but there is kind of like Artie on the brink of erupting, just unable to deal with all these things.
Yeah.
And also his identity, we get the opportunity to really spend a lot of time with him, and the idea that like this two-first is going so against
right. Well, because
what
he sees
stands for
himself
and what
as
he
this
wants to
fine
be.
dining establishment.
It's actually stated in the beginning.
Yeah, he'd rather die or whatever
Right.
than...
This is a fine dining establishment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of kind of what seems to be jealousy and maybe a lack of confidence and direction for himself when he's confronted with his dad Giovanni, this younger chef,
handsome chef.
Handsome chef. But it's interesting because there's actually relationship to all sorts of people from Artie as cooks. He refers to Giovanni, like this young guy. He's also near the beginning referring to, there's these guests that he's bantering with about his older parents and their 75th celebration at the restaurant, and talking about, like what a good cook I think he was.
Yeah, in the army or whatever. Yeah.
But there's just like kind of, it seems like there's all these places that are threatening to Artie and his identity as a cook, and maybe like the best cook in this environment, in this world. And he's being confronted with the fact that maybe he's not, or that other people maybe possess that identity as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one thing that sticks out for me for this is the line that Martina?
I think it's Martina, but
Martina?
I don't know.
Yeah, because he says like Martina. Right. She says to him that he looks at her like food. And we see in this episode more boobs than usual.
More boobs than usual.
And
HBO is entering the boob phase.
No, like they had boobs before. We haven't seen boobs very often on The Sopranos these days, but we see them in this episode, and I think
talk about them.
They even talk about them, and that's the thing. Like, we see, when Artie's at the Bing with Tony being like, well, you could fuck her, right? Like, but he, like, for him, like, he's not that person. He can't be that person.
Yeah.
He looks at her like she is not a person, right? Like, that she's this kind of meat. And same when Christopher is in his hotel room in LA, he's basically like, using this person for drugs,
right,
and sex, right? Like, it's just like, it's the same thing, right? It's this like, I don't know, it's this like consumable good, right? And so it can be like, whether or not it's like high class food like Don Giovanni or whatever, or
Giovanni.
I don't know.
Looks like it was Da Giovanni.
Da Giovanni?
I don't know.
Whatever.
I don't have any Italian. Sorry.
I don't think it was Don Giovanni. That would be confusing. But that it's
the whole
this
womanizing aspect into focus.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's this consumable kind of product, right? And I think that's how Artie treats a lot of the world, or like the people around him,
right?
And as does Tony and all those guys, right? Like, everything's kind of this commodity or this product, right? That's like like even with like Chris going to the luxury lounge, for example, right? It's just all about like getting things, right? Consuming goods. There's another piece in this episode that harkens back to like a really early episode with the Jewish Shylock
Right.
business.
Right.
It's just a quick scene.
Yeah.
But it kind of like reminds us of that. Like it reminds us of how like this world, like how many people in this world are really impacted and like how everyone's connected. And
I think that's a really good point. And it's something I was thinking about too, because there's actually like a notable use of connection between characters in this episode specifically. Like the fact that at the Shylock, they're selling the credit cards. They're also selling the credit cards at Vesuvio's.
Yes.
There's definitely like a link there. And I think
and there's like agency and choice in doing it, right? It's like getting yourself involved versus like kind of being involved.
And at the Shylock too, like he's also then there's kind of like an obliviousness to the impact that it has on people, because then he's kind of like reading these spiritual documents, these readings, whatever it is. But you know, still like being principled and like that kind of that kind of complication of dealing with these moral principles and the fact that you're causing harm to the world. That's something that obviously we've been investigating a lot with this show, but it just kind of shows up again.
Yeah, like how do you see yourself, right? So like, can you still see yourself as this good person,
right?
Who reads religious texts or whatever? If you're selling people's credit card information. Can Artie still see himself as a fine dining chef if he's offering 2-for-1 specials? You know,
right?
It's just kind of Can he really consider himself to be separate from the mob and doing honest work?
Right.
When he's like beating up Benny and whatever.
Right, and I mean he does kind of bring that on himself. There's also so many connections I think in this episode that are bringing characters together. I think that Artie and there's multiple kind of actions that happen in the episode that kind of remind me of what's happening to other people, like Artie punching Benny in the face, Benny responding by kind of like putting his hand in the tomato sauce. There's also Christopher punching, was it Lauren Bacall? Yeah, in the face. But there's like similar things that characters are going through in terms of not having what they want and questioning their identity. Christopher questioning maybe his position or his life in New Jersey, kind of looking for something else and not fitting in, having kind of a relationship to Artie in this episode, and both taking it out through violence of just kind of like maybe that's all they have. But there was something for me in the punching, specifically punching Lauren Bacall, and the way that Artie punches Benny, that kind of tied those two together. There was other kind of examples of connection between them,
the boobs.
Boobs.
Yeah.
There's some food edits and stuff.
Yeah, like he was like, "Who's hungry?" or something like that.
And then there's an edit too.
Eating.
Yeah, there's Christopher. But it is interesting, and I think ultimately this show also possibly gets at that these issues are universal, which is funny because in the very end when Tony's saying you go about and pity for yourself, and Artie's saying that's priceless, it's interesting because obviously that is priceless. That does apply to Tony as well, but realistically perhaps it applies to everybody in this world. And a lot of these issues that are being dealt with are universal.
Yeah.
And that Kevin Finnerty journey that introduces this season and the ideas of who am I, what are these bigger questions, they're kind of applying to every character we've ever come to know in the show.
Yep.
And we're just kind of seeing it manifest.
Yep.
For others. And it's just interesting that they choose to manifest it for Artie. Christopher is now kind of also going back to activity that we've already seen him engage in that's destructive earlier in the show. He's kind of becoming an addict again. He's falling away from the New Jersey family in a way that he's following ideas that are kind of destructive to the life that he has in New Jersey. Not that it's a positive life, but it has led to destructive places for Christopher in the past. And it's probably linked to the drug use. But it's interesting that we have like a repetition of that behavior. We also have a repetition of Artie with these hostesses. It's just this kind of banality and this kind of cycle of always the same shit.
Yeah.
And it's all just too much
for
these people.
Yeah.
And I think that is an important theme that gets reinforced at the end of the show, because one of the beauties of a television show is that it has so long to unwind, And I think there was some criticism of, just kind of rehashing the same things, but I do actually kind of think that in some ways that's sort of the point.
Totally.
And I think that that's another example of connection between these characters.
Yeah. No, and I think maybe it is a little on the nose or whatever, but it is, we can remember back to these scenes, but it kind of just ties them all together for us, right? It allows us to kind of look at these things that we've witnessed throughout the show and see them in the light of this season, which is as these explorations of identity and those bigger questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think every season to a certain extent kind of has a theme and has certain questions that kind of flow through the season on the whole, and I think that this one's been established very strongly. Yeah. From the kind of spiritual journey that Tony had, and then that kind of spiritual journey happening to other characters. I love at the end too, Artie is kind of left alone for that moment. He's on his own in the kitchen. And I do feel like there's something more constructive about the way that he has cooking and his relationship to this book of recipes and his life developing this skill. There's something about it that it's a little bit bittersweet, and Artie's a bit of a disaster, and he's lucky to probably not get killed. Yes. But ultimately, the way that he can cope with this and what he has for his own personal well-being is much more positive and not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But for us, Artie has something that maybe the other characters don't have.
Yeah, I never really know what quite to make of that last scene. I don't know what that means.
It's complicated. I think
Artie.
It could be interpreted in different ways.
That he makes that there's this couple, he does see himself as someone who does feed people, care for people, and it's what Tony says to him earlier on before that last scene, that was in that storm when we came here, that was some of the happiest, I think, the happiest moments of my life. I couldn't imagine anywhere else I would have wanted to be. And that is part of what Artie tries to create, right? He doesn't set out to create a shitty dining experience, right? But these things do happen to him. And so in that scene where he then has his dad's cookbook, I think it's his dad's cookbook, I think so, and he kind of starts from scratch and makes this dish that he doesn't typically make, that makes him think of his dad. It's this rabbit that he shot, which is, again, I can't quite connect. Feels like the rabbit meat might not be the best if you just shot it, but pretty impressive marksmanship, though. It was pretty impressive. I mean, it's crazy, but seems hard. But so I don't know quite what that indicates for us for Artie. Beyond kind of these ways in which you can kind of get in touch with your deeper roots. And I think that is through exploring those questions, who is Artie and where does he come from? Well, he comes from this family that really values, caring for people, feeding people. I think those are his values. And seeing himself as separate from Tony and definitely his people. So I don't know. And he is separate from them. I mean, he's built a life where he's invested in that skill set, and I think that there is something that's presented to us that's more noble about what he does than what almost everybody else we see that what their lives are. And I think that this show has presented that those little moments, those moments with family, those moments around food are incredibly meaningful. And if you think about the whole show, which is very bleak on the whole, is often about this big nothing, has a somewhat nihilistic viewpoint. Even the way it was really interesting, the way this episode is set up, those two Italians who come over, the assassins, say we should go see the space where the Twin Towers were, which for me just kind of reinforces this idea of the show investigating space where things aren't. I actually thought that it was an interesting way of phrasing things, because this show is constantly so focused on emptiness and what isn't, and has a rather bleak way of summing up the world. And those moments, I think, are very powerful, and I think that they are presented to us in ways where they are positive.
And there are still bleak ways of reading them and interpreting maybe like what they lead into, but there is, for me, kind of like a power in those moments. And I think there's a power in that moment, particularly for Artie and maybe for these two other people too. But it's a lot nobler for Artie, and we can take away from the end of that as Artie kind of goes through this journey in this episode and the series on the whole, that he ends up somewhere where we can appreciate and respect him more than almost everybody else.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important. He's obviously incredibly flawed.
Flawed, I was going to say, yeah. Like,
Incredibly flawed. And he's lucky to have Charmaine, who kind of keeps him kind of level for the most part. Even like when Artie just leaves, when he sees all the people walking in asking about low sodium salt or
all
whatever.
the oldies, yeah.
Charmaine just kind of puts a face on and goes and deals with it. She's kind of the one who keeps things rooted and moving forward.
Yeah.
And she's also the first one who says people want to talk with each other, not you. So kind of bringing some honesty to Artie, which is difficult, which is interesting too, because like Artie is confronted with that honesty and other characters aren't in the show. Like think about Tony as a character. Mm-hmm. Many people aren't honest with him because they're afraid to. There's even like a focus on that in a previous episode where I think about that slowdown at the poker table where everybody's laughing and, you know, Carmela says to Tony, you know, of course people, you know, like you and laugh at you, you know, because you're their boss or whatever. And Artie is a boss of sorts, but he doesn't command that kind of respect. And I think that that's hard for him. Even in that moment where he's dealing with his employees, he kind of freaks out and loses
Well, and they're
it.
like talking about his wife, you know, like they don't respect him.
Yeah. So he doesn't possess that same level of respect.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about Christopher kind of falling into this relapse, dealing with the evolution in this episode?
I know. Yeah. It kind of comes. It's a little bit surprising for us, right? Because we haven't really seen that from Christopher in a bit, and so we don't know kind of like when this started again, and what we kind of haven't been tracking him in this as much. But again, like it's like part of this exploration, like who is he and does he have a capacity to change, right? Like he is trying to make this change towards, you know, and Tony, like when Tony asks him, like, is this business or is this time off or whatever? And he's like, no, it's business. But like it is this other thing that he's trying to pursue, and he considers himself to be this kind of creative guy, right? Like, he has these like other funny, like, ulterior motives to it about making money and whatever. Like the ring was so successful and whatever, but he like is really actually, he cares a lot about it. And so the whole like back and forth with him and Ben Kingsley and like just the way, I mean, Ben Kingsley is amazing, but just the way that he really can't control himself. He's not in control in any of those moments. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that he's also searching for something outside of what he possesses in his life, and he's not getting it. And when he's confronted with it in California, it's obvious that he doesn't belong in this world, and perhaps he'll never get it. Like that idea of when he's in the luxury lounge and seeing that people are getting things for free, he's saying, how is that even possible? Like disbelief. And interestingly, in that scene, I feel like there's just a lot going on connecting people and people's lives to one another in this episode, because even there's this kind of snapshot of a video game called True Crime, and it's this kind of like, it's very quick, but in the luxury lounge there's a TV and there's a game, and it's called True Crime, and it kind of gives the impression that it's like a New York mob game. So I feel like it's like everybody emulating and wanting a life from outside. So even like that Western California world is fascinated with the life surrounding Christopher, but doesn't have it. Like it's artificial and kind of recreates it.
Law and Order
SUV.
SUV,
Yeah, no, and exactly, and like that's an example of Christopher just like not belonging in that environment and just showing his ignorance to the way things work there, and yet trying so hard to be a part of it. Yeah. And it's similar to Artie, and I think that like those human conditions are somewhat universal and tie together what these characters go through. Yeah. We have Benny too, who's another character who has been not overly developed throughout the show, but eventually, is actually beat down by Artie and has moments where, Tony says, "You brought this on yourself," to Benny regarding, you did this to my childhood friend where I eat. This is kind of your fault. And then Artie actually goes and engages in behavior that's his fault. And there's this kind of back and forth where they're both damaging themselves and the other person. This idea too of like Artie beating Benny and saying, "I'm stupid," as if like he's, he's searching to not be stupid. But obviously I guess this behavior is damaging to,
Yeah.
To them.
Yeah.
We have Ben Kingsley on an elevator, which makes me think about Matthew Weiner as a writer again, and Mad Men.
Loves elevators.
Loves elevators, yeah. We on a previous Matthew Weiner episode, there's an elevator kind of showing up, but it was actually, it was great. Like the situations that Ben Kingsley finds himself in, being kind of trapped with these people, is pretty amazing. And also, and then Ben Kingsley's life and the situations he's finding himself in with these people, how out of place it is, and what he kind of has to do to deal with it.
Yeah. No, it's funny. Like, he's so like polite and cool to them. Like he's like, but like he's like, he is way smarter than them, and so he could treat them like they are morons without them knowing it.
Right. There's also a lot in this episode just of, even the fact that Ben Kingsley is in it, Lauren Bacall, David Chase showing up on the plane in the end. There is kind of this connection to the real world that we're seeing. Even brands, right? Like all the brands that are referenced in the luxury lounge as sponsors. There's definitely something that takes this episode specifically and ties it in closer to our actual world because of all these these characters and products.
Totally. Yeah, even like, who was it that they mentioned? Sam Rockwell. Like mention other people too that we don't see.
Right.
Which is funny.
Which blows me away from from knowing when this show came on. It's like, oh wow, Sam Rockwell is still on the scene. Yeah. Pretty strong career.
Yeah, he's cool.
He's doing great. He's been doing great for a long time.
Yeah. He wasn't in Cleaver though.
No,
that would have been his breakout.
I don't think Ben Kingsley is going to be in Cleaver either.
Oh man.
We'll see who is.
Yeah.
It's an interesting episode. I think a lot of people think of this one in the same way that they think about Christopher. It's like unsuccessful, and it's wasted time, and it's surprising that so close to the end of the series they leave New Jersey and have these seemingly irrelevant storylines. And I kind of get it, but I do think there's an aspect of repetition, and I think it's important to close out Artie as a character, or to give him his moment and to kind of investigate things that have been brewing.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the strongest episode of Sopranos, but I think there's still a lot in there, and it does deal with some interesting themes.
Yeah, and it does kind of break up our season.
It's also like a kind of like a more just simple, entertaining, fun episode than a lot of the others are. I think it's a little more literal than everything else that's surrounding. For sure in season 6, everything gets pretty heavy and existential. Yeah. Which it still is in this episode, but there's more on the surface just in terms of what's actually happening. Yeah. So, what does this lead us into? What do we have coming up?
Johnny Cakes.
And that's interesting too, right? Like Vito doesn't show up at all.
Well, we just hear, Phil's pretty mad about it.
He's pretty mad about it, but that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Phil will continue to be mad about it next episode.
Yeah. He'll continue to be.
I like that, like when he comes up to Tony and indicates to Tony that he knows that Tony killed Rusty, right? Like Johnny, right. He's like, Johnny Sachs said thank you for the news or whatever. And that he then mentions like the Sleepy Hollow reference, right? Which makes us think back to Steve Buscemi.
Right.
Tony B.
That was a good pickup by Sopranos Autopsy.
I guess you told me that.
I don't take credit for that, but that is great. You should all go read Sopranos Autopsy.
Definitely.
Where, so Tony, having killed Tony Blundetto, who referred to himself as he did not refer to himself as Ichabod Crane, but others referred to him as Ichabod Crane, and he said that others were very sorry about that. But then this concept of the Headless Horseman, who in the story of Ichabod Crane was the one who actually killed Ichabod Crane.
Right.
There's some pretty interesting coding going on in that conversation.
Right. Yeah.
And it's interesting too, like in this episode where it is kind of a standalone episode, the developments that happen are character based and characters that aren't relevant to the most important parts of the story of Sopranos, and yet there's still small things that happen that do propel the narrative of the season forward, like Rusty getting killed.
Right.
So even in these standalone episodes, things do happen that are related to the series on the whole, which is always really successfully done, I think.
Yeah. And Cleaver's, starting to get
Cleaver's going to be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Cleaver's getting made. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
It's going to be like Saw, Godfather.
Yeah.
It's going to be like all the best movies.
Yeah, all of them put together.
So we'll be back soon. We're going to continue with season 6. We appreciate you listening.
Yeah.
And if you have any questions or any thoughts or any things that you hate about this show, you can email us.
Oh, hate about our show.
Hate about our show?
Hate about our podcast?
That would be hard for us to take, but maybe it's good.
I don't know if they have anything to hate about Sopranos, but...
Oh, no. There's nothing to say about Sopranos.
Okay.
It's perfect. It's a perfect show.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon.